The most dangerous secret is not the one people hide from the world. It is the one they hide from the person who built their world with them. The ballroom glittered beneath 1,000 suspended lights, each crystal reflecting gold across the polished marble floor of the Sterling Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. A string quartet played softly near the stage while executives, investors, politicians, and media personalities moved through the crowd carrying champagne glasses and polished smiles. It was the engagement party everyone in the city had been talking about for weeks. Ethan Sterling, billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Dynamics, stood at the center of it all. At 42 years old, he looked exactly like the man business magazines love to place on their covers. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His confident smile never seemed to fade. To everyone watching, he appeared to have everything: wealth, influence, success, and now, a beautiful fiancée standing proudly beside him. Vanessa Blake glowed beneath the ballroom lights. Her diamond engagement ring caught the attention of nearly every guest who passed. She leaned comfortably against Ethan's arm as photographers captured image after image. "This is your night," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "Our night." Applause erupted from one side of the room as another group of guests arrived. Across the ballroom, Ethan noticed reporters setting up near the stage where he would soon deliver a speech. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Almost exactly. There was one final guest he had personally invited. A guest many people believed should not even be there. Ethan glanced toward the entrance. His expression tightened for a moment. Then he checked his watch. "You really think she will come?" Vanessa asked quietly. Ethan took a sip of champagne. "She always surprises people." Vanessa laughed softly. "Well, tonight should be interesting." Several nearby guests exchanged curious looks. Everyone knew the rumors. Everyone knew Ethan was technically still married. The divorce had been delayed for months by legal complications nobody fully understood. Most people assumed it was simply another corporate issue involving lawyers and paperwork. Few knew the real story. Years earlier, before the billion-dollar success, before magazine covers and luxury penthouses, Ethan Sterling had built Sterling Dynamics alongside a woman named Amara Johnson Sterling. They had started with little more than a rented garage, an aging laptop, and impossible dreams. Then something had changed. Or at least that was the version of the story Ethan had told himself for years. The ballroom doors suddenly opened. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Even the musicians seemed to lose their rhythm for a second. Amara Johnson Sterling stepped inside. The reaction moved through the crowd like a wave. Some people recognized her immediately. Others only knew her from old company photographs rarely seen anymore. At 38 years old, Amara carried herself with a calm confidence that required no introduction. She wore a simple black evening dress that contrasted sharply with the extravagance surrounding her. No diamonds, no entourage, no attempt to compete for attention. Yet somehow every eye in the room found her. She paused briefly beneath the entrance lights. Her expression remained composed, dignified, untouchable. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. It annoyed him that after all these years, she still had that effect on him. Vanessa noticed his reaction immediately. "So she came." "Yes," Ethan answered. "She came." Amara began walking across the ballroom. Guests instinctively moved aside. Whispers followed her path. Some were curious. Some were sympathetic. Some simply wanted entertainment. She ignored all of it. The distance between her and Ethan slowly disappeared. Every step seemed to increase the tension inside the room. When she finally stopped a few feet away, silence settled over the nearby crowd. "Amara," Ethan said, "thank you for coming." Her eyes met his. "You invited me." Vanessa offered a smile that never reached her eyes. "It is wonderful to finally see you again." Amara looked at her politely. "Congratulations on the engagement." The response surprised Vanessa. There was no bitterness, no jealousy, no visible anger, only calm. Somehow that made the atmosphere even more uncomfortable. Ethan studied Amara carefully. He had expected resentment. He had expected pain. Instead, she looked like someone carrying knowledge nobody else possessed. Before he could speak again, Amara's attention drifted toward the stage. A large presentation screen displayed images celebrating Sterling Dynamics and its future expansion. Her gaze lingered for a second longer than expected. Then something unusual happened. A faint expression crossed her face. Not sadness, not regret, Recognition, almost as if she had noticed something nobody else had seen. Ethan followed her eyes toward the stage, but found nothing unusual. When he looked back, Amara's calm smile had returned. "Enjoy your evening, Ethan," she said softly. Then she walked deeper into the ballroom. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd while an unfamiliar sense of unease settled over him. Across the room, beneath the glow of golden lights and the applause of celebrating guests, Amara quietly observed the stage. And for the first time that night, she realized exactly what was about to happen. The unease Ethan Sterling felt refused to disappear. Even as the orchestra resumed and conversations returned to normal, his attention kept drifting across the ballroom toward Amara. She stood near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, speaking politely with several guests who seemed genuinely happy to see her. What bothered Ethan was not her presence. It was her composure. He had expected discomfort. He had expected hesitation. Instead, she looked like someone attending an event whose ending she already knew. Vanessa noticed it too. She seemed surprisingly relaxed for someone watching her husband celebrate an engagement, she said quietly. Ethan forced a smile. That is Amara. She always knows how to hide what she feels. Across the room, a small group of executives gathered around Amara. Some had worked with Sterling Dynamics during its earliest years. Others remembered stories about the woman whose name had slowly disappeared from company conversations. "It has been a long time," one executive told her. "Too long," Amara replied warmly. "You should come back to the company someday," another joked. A faint smile touched her face. Life has a funny way of bringing people back where they belong. The answer seemed harmless, yet something about it caused several people to exchange curious looks. Nearby, a well-known financial journalist named Daniel Mercer had been observing the evening from the moment Amara arrived. Daniel specialized in corporate history and billion-dollar mergers. He knew Sterling Dynamics better than most reporters. More importantly, he remembered something many people had forgotten. He remembered the early interviews, the garage startup stories, the photographs showing Ethan and Amara standing side by side during the company's first years. As he watched her now, a question formed in his mind. Why would a woman who helped build a billion-dollar company attend her husband's engagement party looking completely unshaken? Daniel approached politely. "Mrs. Sterling." Amara turned toward him. "Mr. Mercer, you remember me?" She smiled. "You interviewed us when Sterling Dynamics had 12 employees and one folding conference table." Daniel laughed. "I am impressed. You asked difficult questions. That was my job." For a moment they spoke casually. Then Daniel lowered his voice. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Amara's expression remained calm. "You can ask." Daniel glanced toward the stage where preparations continued for Ethan's speech. "Why are you really here tonight?" The question lingered between them. Amara looked toward the stage as well. The giant presentation screen displayed images celebrating the future of Sterling Dynamics. Future expansion, future leadership, future success. Then her eyes settled on a document briefly visible on a monitor near the podium. The same document she had noticed earlier. "Because invitations matter," she answered softly. Daniel frowned slightly. "That sounds like a very careful answer." "It is." Before he could ask another question, applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Ethan and Vanessa were making their way toward the stage. The official celebration was beginning. Guests slowly gathered around round tables decorated with crystal centerpieces and white roses. Cameras turned toward the platform. Executives found their seats. The room buzzed with anticipation. Ethan stepped behind the podium and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Applause filled the ballroom. He smiled confidently. "Many of you have supported Sterling Dynamics throughout an incredible journey. Tonight is not only a celebration of my engagement to Vanessa Blake. It is also a celebration of the future." More applause followed. Ethan continued speaking about innovation, expansion, and ambitious plans for the years ahead. The audience listened attentively. Investors nodded. Reporters took notes. Vanessa watched proudly from the front row. Yet Amara remained completely still. Daniel Mercer noticed it immediately. While everyone else focused on Ethan's speech, Amara kept glancing toward the side of the stage where several legal and corporate presentation folders rested on a table. Her attention never seemed random. It seemed deliberate, almost calculated. As Ethan described the next chapter of Sterling Dynamics, an event coordinator approached the stage carrying a sealed envelope. The woman whispered something to one of Ethan's assistants before placing the envelope beside the presentation materials. Nobody appeared concerned. It looked routine. Yet the moment Amara saw the envelope, something changed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion crossed her face. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. Daniel saw it happen. So did one elderly board member seated nearby. Ethan remained unaware. He continued speaking confidently beneath the bright lights. "The future of this company has never been stronger," he declared. The crowd applauded again. Across the ballroom, Amara quietly folded her hands and looked toward the stage. Then she whispered 4 words so softly that nobody around her could hear them. "Not the future you expect." The applause gradually faded as Ethan Sterling stepped away from the podium. The audience appeared energized by his speech. Investors discussed expansion plans. Reporters compared notes. Executives exchanged confident smiles about the future of Sterling Dynamics. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Yet beneath the polished atmosphere of celebration, a strange tension had begun spreading through the ballroom. It started quietly. A glance here. A whispered conversation there. Questions nobody could quite explain. Daniel Mercer felt it immediately. Years of journalism had trained him to recognize moments when a story was beginning to change direction. He stood near the rear of the ballroom, watching Amara Johnson Sterling carefully. She remained calm. Too calm. Most people attending an event like this under similar circumstances would appear uncomfortable. Some would leave early. Others would avoid attention entirely. Amara was doing neither. She moved through the room with quiet confidence, greeting former colleagues and old friends as if she belonged there. Daniel finally approached an elderly board member named Charles Whitaker, one of the few people still connected to the earliest days of Sterling Dynamics. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Charles adjusted his glasses. "Depends on the question." Daniel glanced toward Amara. Why does she seem completely unbothered by any of this? Charles followed his gaze. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "Because Amara was never the type to panic." "That is not what I mean." Charles smiled faintly. "I know." Before Daniel could continue, another voice joined the conversation. Vanessa Blake had approached without either man noticing. Her smile was elegant but calculated. "You journalists always want a mystery." Daniel laughed politely. "It is an occupational hazard." Vanessa turned toward Amara across the room. "Honestly, I think people are making too much of her presence tonight." Charles remained silent. Vanessa continued. "The company has moved on. Ethan has moved on. Everyone eventually moves on." The words sounded harmless enough, but something about her tone caused several nearby guests to look uncomfortable. Across the ballroom, Amara appeared not to notice. Or perhaps she simply chose not to react. Vanessa excused herself and headed toward a group of investors near the stage. As soon as she left, Charles looked at Daniel. "Some people move on," he said quietly. "Others rewrite history." Daniel immediately recognized the significance of the statement. "What does that mean?" Charles stared toward the giant presentation screen. "It means there are stories people stop telling because they become inconvenient." Before Daniel could ask another question, movement near the stage drew everyone's attention. Event staff were preparing a special presentation celebrating the history of Sterling Dynamics. Large photographs began appearing on the screen. The audience turned toward the display. Early product launches, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, corporate milestones, media appearances. The crowd applauded each image. Ethan and Vanessa stood proudly near the front of the room. Then something unexpected happened. One photograph appeared showing Sterling Dynamics during its first year. The image featured a tiny office, folding tables, and a handful of exhausted employees. Most guests barely glanced at it. But Daniel noticed something immediately. Amara stood in the center of the photograph beside Ethan. Not in the background. Not off to the side. Beside him, another image appeared. Again, Amara was there. Then another. Then another. Every major milestone from the company's earliest years seemed to include her. Daniel looked around the room. Other guests had noticed it too. Quiet conversations started spreading through the audience. "I thought she worked there briefly. I did not realize she was involved that early. Was she a founder?" The questions multiplied. Vanessa heard them. Her smile tightened. She immediately approached the event coordinator responsible for the presentation. A brief conversation followed. Moments later, the photographs advanced more quickly. The older images disappeared. Modern corporate achievements replaced them. Yet the damage had already been done. Curiosity had entered the room. Meanwhile, Amara walked toward a display case containing memorabilia from Sterling Dynamics history. Inside were prototypes, awards, and framed newspaper articles. Her eyes settled on one particular article from nearly 15 years earlier. She studied it for a moment before smiling softly to herself. Daniel approached again. "You seem to know something." Amara looked at him. "What makes you think that?" "Because everyone else is reacting to the evening. You are reacting to something beyond it." For the first time, genuine amusement appeared in her eyes. "You really are a good journalist." "That is not an answer." "No," she replied. "It is not." Across the ballroom, Ethan watched the exchange from a distance. The uneasy feeling inside him continued growing. He could not explain it. Nothing had gone wrong. The event remained successful. Investors were happy. Media coverage looked positive. Yet every time he looked toward Amara, he felt as though he had missed something important. Then his attention shifted toward the table beside the stage. The sealed envelope remained exactly where the event coordinator had placed it earlier. For some reason, he found himself staring at it. At that exact moment, a senior legal assistant entered the ballroom carrying a second envelope marked confidential. The woman headed directly toward the stage. And when Amara noticed the new arrival, her calm expression transformed once more into that same look of quiet recognition that suggested the night's most important moment had finally begun. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed, although most guests could not yet explain why. The celebration continued. Champagne glasses clinked. Soft music floated beneath conversations. Waiters moved between tables carrying elegant trays. Yet beneath the polished surface of the evening, something else had begun to take shape. Curiosity, suspicion, expectation. Ethan Sterling stood near the stage greeting investors while trying to ignore the growing unease in his mind. Every instinct he had developed during 2 decades of business success was warning him that something was wrong. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But wrong enough that he could not stop looking toward the legal assistant who had recently arrived carrying the second confidential envelope. Across the ballroom, Amara Johnson Sterling remained composed. She accepted polite greetings from former employees and old business associates. Her posture never changed. Her expression remained calm. Yet there was something different now. The waiting seemed almost over. Near the front of the room, Vanessa Blake noticed it too. She approached Ethan and lowered her voice. "What is going on tonight?" Ethan forced a smile. "Nothing." "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Pretend you are not worried." Ethan glanced toward the stage. "I am not worried." Vanessa followed his gaze. "Then why do you keep looking at those envelopes?" Ethan did not answer. Because the truth was he had been asking himself the same question. Several minutes later, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with tonight's celebration, we have one final corporate announcement from Sterling Dynamics." Applause filled the room. Ethan frowned slightly. He had not scheduled another announcement. One of his senior executives approached the stage and spoke briefly with the master of ceremonies. Then the executive opened the first sealed envelope. The crowd remained attentive but relaxed. Most assumed it involved expansion plans or shareholder updates. Daniel Mercer immediately raised his notebook. His instincts told him not to miss a single word. The executive adjusted his glasses and began reading. "This concerns a review of archived founding documents recently completed during preparation for the upcoming corporate restructuring process." Several board members exchanged confused looks. Ethan's attention sharpened immediately. Corporate restructuring? He had approved preliminary discussions, but nothing requiring public announcement. The executive continued. "During this review, certain historical ownership records required additional legal verification." Silence slowly spread across the ballroom. The language sounded unusually formal. Even Vanessa appeared uncomfortable now. Ethan stepped closer to the stage. "What exactly is this?" he asked quietly. The executive looked uncertain. "The legal department requested that it be presented tonight." Ethan's confusion deepened. Across the room, Amara remained perfectly still. Daniel noticed. So did Charles Whitaker. The executive opened the second envelope. This one appeared significantly older. The paper inside showed signs of age. Several attorneys seated near the stage leaned forward. Ethan's pulse quickened. The following material was recovered from original incorporation archives, and verified through independent legal review. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. Nobody fully understood what was happening, yet everyone sensed the significance. The executive continued reading. The documents concern founding ownership allocations established during the creation of Sterling Dynamics 15 years ago. A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Founding ownership. That phrase immediately captured attention. Investors stopped talking. Reporters lifted cameras. Board members focused on the stage. Ethan felt the room shifting around him. Then something happened that froze him completely. A photograph appeared on the giant screen behind the stage. It showed the original garage where Sterling Dynamics had begun. The image displayed two people standing beside a folding table covered with computer components. Ethan recognized it instantly. So did everyone else. Himself and Amara. Younger. Exhausted. Hopeful. Building a dream together. More images followed. Early contracts. Prototype designs. Business registration forms. Historic records nobody had seen publicly in years. The audience watched in fascination. Daniel Mercer could barely write fast enough. The story was becoming larger by the minute. Vanessa looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Why are they showing all this?" she whispered. Nobody answered. Then the executive reached the final page. His voice grew even more cautious. The legal department determined that certain documents require immediate board review before any ownership-related changes proceed. Now the ballroom had become completely silent. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Ethan stared at the stage. Every instinct told him the next sentence mattered. Across the room, Amara slowly folded her hands. Her eyes never left the screen. The executive looked toward the attorneys seated near the front. One of them nodded. Permission granted. Authorization confirmed. Then the executive took a breath and prepared to read the specific clause recovered from the original founding records. And for the first time all evening, Ethan Sterling realized that whatever happened next might not only change the engagement party. It might change everything he believed about the company he thought he owned. For several long seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. The executive stood beneath the bright stage lights holding the final page while hundreds of eyes remained fixed upon him. The silence felt almost unnatural. Ethan Sterling could hear the faint hum of the hotel's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic beyond the glass walls overlooking Chicago. "Read it," one board member finally said. The executive nodded. The following clause appears within the original founding ownership agreement executed during the incorporation of Sterling Dynamics. He adjusted the document and continued. This agreement recognizes Ethan Sterling and Amara Johnson as equal founding partners responsible for the creation, development, financing, and strategic direction of Sterling Dynamics. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Many people had never heard Amara described that way. Equal founding partner. Not employee. Not assistant. Not former spouse. Partner. Daniel Mercer immediately began writing. Cameras lifted throughout the room. Ethan remained frozen. The executive continued. The agreement further establishes that any future transfer, restructuring, or reassignment of founding ownership interests requires written authorization from both founding partners unless otherwise superseded by a legally executed amendment. Now the room was fully awake. Investors exchanged concerned looks. Attorneys whispered among themselves. Vanessa stared at Ethan. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Ethan did not answer because he was no longer listening to her. His attention had drifted toward the giant screen where the old photographs remained displayed. Younger versions of himself, and Amara smiled back from another lifetime. A lifetime he had almost forgotten. Suddenly the ballroom disappeared from his mind. He remembered a small garage on the outskirts of Chicago. He remembered winter nights when the heater barely worked. He remembered folding chairs, unpaid bills, and endless cups of cheap coffee. Most of all, he remembered Amara. 15 years earlier, Sterling Dynamics had not been a corporation. It had been a dream. Ethan had been a talented engineer with ambitious ideas, but very little money. Amara had been the person who believed in those ideas before anyone else did. She worked full-time during the day and spent evenings helping him build prototypes. When suppliers refused credit, she negotiated payment plans. When investors rejected them, she created presentations that earned second meetings. When payroll became impossible, she used her personal savings to keep employees working. Ethan remembered one particular winter evening. Snow had accumulated outside the garage while the two of them sat beneath fluorescent lights reviewing financial reports. The company had less than 3 weeks of operating cash remaining. Failure seemed inevitable. Maybe this is the end, Ethan had said. Amara looked up from her laptop. Then tomorrow we start again. You make it sound easy. No, she smiled. I make it sound possible. The memory hit him with unexpected force. Across the ballroom, Amara stood quietly near the display case. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet Ethan suddenly found himself remembering dozens of moments he had spent years trying not to revisit. The sacrifices, the setbacks, the victories they achieved together. The first major client, the first profitable quarter, the first office, the first time they truly believed the company might survive. None of those memories belonged only to him. Back on the stage, the executive continued presenting historical documents. Additional photographs appeared, newspaper clippings, investor announcements, early business registrations. In image after image, Amara stood beside Ethan. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Daniel Mercer watched the audience carefully. Public opinion was shifting. Guests who arrived expecting an engagement celebration were now witnessing something entirely different. They were discovering a forgotten chapter of corporate history. Vanessa sensed it too. She approached Ethan again. Why have I never heard any of this? Ethan struggled to answer. The truth was uncomfortable. Over the years, the story had become simpler, cleaner, easier to tell. Interviews focused on him. Corporate biographies highlighted his achievements. Gradually, Amara's role faded from public conversations. At first unintentionally. Later, perhaps not entirely. Ethan, Vanessa pressed. Before he could respond, another image appeared on the giant screen. This one captured a moment shortly after Sterling Dynamics secured its first major investment. Ethan and Amara stood together in front of the original office building holding a framed incorporation certificate. The audience leaned forward. Something about the document visible in the photograph caught the attention of several attorneys. One of them immediately stood and approached the stage. The legal assistant handed him another folder. He opened it, reviewed several pages, and then looked toward the board members with a serious expression. Charles Whitaker saw the reaction and quietly closed his eyes. He already knew what was coming. Across the room, Amara simply watched. The waiting was nearly over. And as the attorney stepped toward the microphone with the newly reviewed records in his hands, the future Ethan Sterling had celebrated only an hour earlier suddenly seemed far less certain than it had before. The attorney accepted the folder from the legal assistant and stepped beneath the bright stage lights. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had transformed completely. What had begun as a glamorous engagement celebration now felt like a corporate hearing unfolding before an audience of executives, investors, journalists, and board members. Nobody was interested in champagne anymore. Nobody was discussing the engagement. Every eye remained fixed on the documents in the attorney's hands. Ethan Sterling stood motionless near the front row. Vanessa Blake remained beside him. But for the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain about where she belonged. Across the room, Amara Johnson Sterling watched quietly from near the display case. The years had taught her patience. Tonight, patience was finally being rewarded. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began speaking. Before proceeding, it is important to understand the historical circumstances surrounding these documents. His voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. Several records reviewed during the restructuring process indicate that Sterling Dynamics experienced a severe financial crisis during its second year of operation. Ethan felt another memory surface, one he had not revisited in years. The attorney continued. At the time, payroll obligations exceeded available cash reserves. Investor commitments had collapsed. Bankruptcy was considered a realistic possibility. Murmurs spread through the audience. Many people knew Sterling Dynamics as a corporate giant worth billions of dollars. Few knew how close it had once come to disappearing entirely. The giant screen behind the stage displayed financial statements from those early years. Red numbers dominated the reports. Losses, debt, uncertainty. Then another image appeared. A small apartment. Boxes stacked against walls. Furniture marked with sale tags. Ethan stared at the photograph in disbelief. He remembered that apartment. More importantly, he remembered why the photograph existed. 15 years earlier, when the company faced collapse, he had exhausted every available option. Investors refused additional funding. Banks rejected loan applications. Suppliers demanded payment. Employees worried about losing their jobs. Ethan had reached a point where giving up seemed unavoidable. But Amara had refused to surrender. The memory unfolded vividly inside his mind. She had sat across from him at their tiny kitchen table reviewing financial reports. Outside, rain struck the apartment windows. Inside, silence filled the room. "We are out of time," Ethan had said. "Maybe." "There is no maybe. There is always a maybe." He remembered becoming frustrated. "Amara, we do not have the money." She had looked at him carefully before opening a folder. "Then we create time." Ethan remembered the shock when he saw the documents. Amara had sold nearly everything she owned. Personal investments, family heirlooms, property inherited from her grandfather, savings she had spent years building. She converted it all into operating capital for Sterling Dynamics. "You cannot do this," Ethan had told her. "Watch me." Back in the present, the attorney continued presenting evidence. According to verified records, a substantial emergency capital contribution was made during the crisis period. Another document appeared on the screen. The audience leaned forward. Daniel Mercer immediately recognized its significance. The contribution amount was extraordinary considering the company's size at the time. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The attorney continued. The contribution originated from personal assets owned by one of the founding partners. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He already knew where this was going, yet hearing it presented publicly felt entirely different. The attorney displayed additional records: asset transfers, banking documents, property sales, signed agreements. Every page pointed toward the same conclusion. Amara had personally saved Sterling Dynamics. Without her sacrifice, the company would likely have ceased operations before reaching its third year. The room remained silent. Even Vanessa appeared stunned. She looked toward Amara for the first time not as a former spouse, but as someone whose role in the company's history had been dramatically underestimated. Daniel continued writing. The story was becoming larger than any engagement announcement could ever be. Then Charles Whitaker slowly stood from his table. "I remember those days," he said. His voice carried through the room. Most of us believed the company was finished. Several guests turned toward him. Charles continued. "Amara refused to let it die." Ethan lowered his eyes. More memories surfaced. The first profitable quarter after the crisis. The celebration dinner they could barely afford. The promises they made about building the future together. Promises that eventually disappeared beneath success, influence, and family pressure. On the giant screen, the final financial document faded away. The attorney looked toward the board members. The significance of these records extends beyond historical recognition. Those words immediately captured everyone's attention. Historical recognition was one thing. Legal significance was something entirely different. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Across the room, Amara finally looked directly toward the stage. The expression in her eyes remained calm, but there was no longer any uncertainty. The moment she had anticipated for years was approaching. The attorney opened another section of the recovered file. Several pages contained legal language, signatures, and ownership provisions. The board members began reading along with visible concern. Then the attorney lifted one particular document and took a slow breath before speaking. The financial contribution executed during the crisis period activated a contingency ownership clause contained within the original founding agreement. Confusion spread through the audience. Investors leaned forward. Journalists prepared cameras. Ethan stared at the document. And as the attorney prepared to explain exactly what that clause meant, the future of Sterling Dynamics stood balanced on a truth that had remained hidden for 15 years. The ballroom remained frozen beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers as the attorney carefully placed the recovered document onto the podium. The silence had become so complete that even the soft clinking of a glass from the back of the room seemed unusually loud. Investors, reporters, board members, and guests all waited for the explanation that now appeared capable of changing the entire meaning of the evening. Ethan Sterling stood motionless near the front of the room. His attention never left the document. Across the ballroom, Amara Johnson Sterling remained calm, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. She had spent years learning how to wait. Tonight, waiting was no longer necessary. The attorney adjusted his glasses and looked toward the board members before continuing. The contingency ownership clause was created during the company's earliest formation period. At the time, both founders agreed that extraordinary financial intervention by either partner would trigger a reassessment of long-term ownership protections. Several guests exchanged confused looks. The legal language sounded complex, but everyone understood one thing. The clause mattered. The attorney continued. The purpose of the clause was simple. If one founder personally prevented the collapse of the company through substantial financial sacrifice, that founder would receive additional protected ownership rights that could not be removed without written consent. A ripple of whispers spread throughout the room. Daniel Mercer immediately wrote down every word. Nearby reporters did the same. Ethan felt a tightening sensation in his chest. He remembered drafting those protections years ago. Back then, neither he nor Amara had possessed wealth. They had only possessed trust. They believed they would always protect each other. The attorney opened another page. The review determined that the financial contribution made during the company's crisis period activated the clause in full. More whispers followed. Vanessa looked toward Ethan. "You knew about this?" she asked quietly. Ethan did not answer immediately. The truth was uncomfortable. He remembered the existence of the clause, but over time it had become buried beneath mergers, restructurings, acquisitions, and years of legal paperwork. He had assumed newer agreements replaced the original protections. Apparently, they had not. On the giant screen, a scanned copy of the original document appeared. Signatures filled the bottom section. Ethan's signature, Amara's signature, dates, witnesses, legal certifications. Everything appeared authentic. The attorney pointed toward a highlighted section. According to the original agreement, the activated ownership protection remained attached to all future ownership structures unless specifically revoked by both founders. The ballroom erupted into conversation. Board members leaned toward one another. Investors began asking questions. Reporters rushed to confirm details. The atmosphere no longer resembled an engagement party. It resembled the center of a major corporate revelation. Daniel noticed something interesting. Amara still had not spoken. While everyone else reacted emotionally, she simply observed. Her silence carried more weight than any speech could have. Charles Whitaker slowly approached her. "You knew this would eventually surface." Amara looked toward the stage. "I hoped the truth would." Charles nodded. "Why now?" For a moment she remained silent. Then she answered softly. "Because someone finally looked at the original records instead of the revised versions." Charles understood immediately. Years of amendments, restructurings, and legal modifications had encouraged people to focus on recent documents. Few had bothered to examine the foundation beneath them. The attorney continued speaking. "The legal department has verified the validity of the clause through independent review. No evidence was found indicating lawful termination of the provision." Ethan felt as though the room had shifted beneath his feet. For years he had operated under assumptions that now appeared far less certain. Across the ballroom, Vanessa's confidence had begun to fade. She glanced toward the guests surrounding them. Many no longer looked at her. Their attention remained fixed on Amara. For the first time all evening, Vanessa understood something important. The woman she had considered a forgotten chapter was rapidly becoming the central figure in the room. Another board member stood. "Does this affect current ownership?" he asked. The question immediately silenced the crowd again. Everyone wanted the answer. The attorney looked down at the remaining pages. "That determination requires review of one final document recovered from the founding archives." A collective breath seemed to move through the ballroom. One final document. Ethan stared toward the podium. Daniel raised his camera. Investors leaned forward. Even the musicians near the stage had stopped pretending to prepare for the next performance. The attorney carefully opened the last folder in the recovered file. Inside rested a single document protected within a transparent sleeve. Its paper appeared older than everything else presented that evening. Several signatures were visible near the bottom. The attorney's expression changed the moment he reviewed it. Not surprise. Concern. Serious concern. Ethan noticed immediately. So did Amara. The attorney looked toward the board members, then toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said carefully, "before any conclusions can be reached, everyone needs to see what is written here." And as the giant screen behind him slowly illuminated with the image of the final recovered document, Ethan Sterling realized that the most important secret in the history of Sterling Dynamics had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years. The giant screen illuminated the ballroom with a pale white glow as the final recovered document appeared before hundreds of stunned guests. For a moment, nobody spoke. The image displayed an original legal attachment dated from Sterling Dynamics' earliest days. The document looked ordinary at first glance, but the reaction from the attorneys and board members made it clear that it was anything but ordinary. Ethan Sterling stared at the screen. Every line seemed strangely familiar. Then recognition hit him. He had signed it years ago, not during a celebration, not during a successful period, during one of the most desperate weeks in the company's history. The attorney allowed the silence to settle before speaking. This attachment was executed simultaneously with the Emergency Capital Contribution Agreement. He pointed toward a highlighted section. Its purpose was to protect the company from external acquisition during financial distress. Several investors exchanged concerned looks. Daniel Mercer raised his camera and captured the screen. Every journalist in the room sensed that the evening had moved far beyond an engagement announcement. The attorney continued. According to this provision, the founder providing emergency stabilization funding would receive a permanent protected interest attached to all future corporate ownership structures. A wave of whispers moved through the ballroom. Ethan felt his pulse accelerate. He remembered fragments of those negotiations. Long nights. Endless legal reviews. Fear that everything they had built would disappear. Back then, he had signed whatever was necessary to save the company. He trusted Amara completely. Across the room, Amara Johnson Sterling remained calm. She had not interrupted a single presentation. She had not demanded attention. She had not corrected anyone. The truth was revealing itself without her assistance. Charles Whitaker looked toward her and quietly shook his head in amazement. 15 years, he whispered. 15 years hidden in plain sight. The attorney opened another page. The protected interest could only be removed through a jointly executed termination instrument signed by both founders and certified by independent counsel. He paused before adding the next sentence. No such termination instrument has been located. The room erupted into conversation. Attorneys immediately began reviewing their own copies. Board members exchanged worried expressions. Reporters rushed to confirm details with legal analysts attending the event. Vanessa Blake stood frozen beside Ethan. What exactly does this mean? She asked. Ethan could not answer, because for the first time that evening, he was beginning to understand. Throughout the years, everyone had focused on stock structures, mergers, acquisitions, and executive authority. But very few people had ever gone back to the foundation beneath those layers. The foundation that he and Amara created together. Daniel approached one of the corporate attorneys. Could this still be enforceable? The attorney answered carefully. If the documentation is authentic and never properly revoked, the implications could be substantial. That single word traveled through the ballroom almost instantly. Substantial. Guests repeated it. Investors repeated it. Reporters wrote it down. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Memories continued returning. He remembered sitting beside Amara at a small folding table reviewing incorporation papers. He remembered telling her that if either one of them ever saved the company from collapse, that sacrifice should never be forgotten. At the time, the clause seemed symbolic. A gesture of trust between two people who believed they would always remain partners. Neither of them imagined Sterling Dynamics would someday become a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The attorney looked toward the board. There is one final detail. Silence returned immediately. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The protected interest established by this agreement was not passive. Several board members straightened in their seats. The attorney continued. It included specific governance rights associated with major ownership decisions. Vanessa looked confused. Investors looked alarmed. Daniel Mercer looked fascinated. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Governance rights. He remembered those words now. Very clearly. The document had been designed to prevent exactly what nearly happened during the company's crisis years. It guaranteed that the person who saved Sterling Dynamics could never be completely excluded from its future. The attorney adjusted his glasses and reviewed the final page once more. The legal department has not yet reached a final conclusion regarding current ownership percentages. A few guests visibly relaxed. Then the attorney continued. However, Preliminary findings indicate that the protected interest remains active within the corporate structure today. The relief disappeared instantly. Across the ballroom, cameras flashed. Reporters began sending updates to their editors. Board members requested emergency consultations. Investors reached for their phones. The engagement party no longer existed. Only the truth remained. Ethan slowly turned toward Amara. For the first time all evening, their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. There was no triumph in her expression, no revenge, no satisfaction, only a quiet sadness for everything that had been lost. That reaction unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Then the attorney raised one final folder recovered from the archives. Unlike the previous documents, this folder contained a certified property record tied directly to the company's ownership structure. Several attorneys immediately stood as soon as they recognized it. The board members leaned forward. Daniel lifted his camera again. And when the attorney announced that the next document would reveal exactly whose name remained attached to the foundational deed of Sterling Dynamics, every person in the ballroom understood that the most shocking revelation of the night was still moments away. The ballroom stood suspended in a silence so complete that it no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like history waiting to reveal itself. The attorney carefully placed the certified property record on the podium while the giant screen behind him displayed the document's cover page. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Investors abandoned their conversations. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving. Every person in the room understood that the answer to a question nobody had asked for years was about to appear. Ethan Sterling remained frozen near the front of the stage. Vanessa Blake stood beside him, but the confidence she carried earlier in the evening had almost completely disappeared. Across the room, Amara Johnson Sterling remained exactly as she had been all night. Calm, patient, composed. The attorney opened the certified record and began speaking. During the original formation of Sterling Dynamics, the company operated under a foundational ownership structure tied to the founding deed. Several legal professionals in attendance nodded immediately. They understood the significance. Foundational deeds were often overlooked after years of corporate growth, but they remained among the most important records in existence. The attorney continued. The deed established the controlling framework through which all future ownership interests would be derived. Daniel Mercer quickly wrote down every word. He knew this story would dominate financial headlines by morning. The attorney turned another page. As part of the verification process, the legal department requested direct certification from the original filing archives. The giant screen displayed official seals, registration numbers, signatures, and certifications. No one could question the authenticity. The documents were real. The room became even quieter. Ethan stared at the screen. Deep inside, he already sensed what was coming. Not because he remembered every legal detail. He did not. Too many years had passed. Too many lawyers had managed too many transactions. But because every revelation tonight had pointed in the same direction, toward a truth he had gradually allowed himself to forget. The attorney finally reached the critical section. The certified filing identifies the protected founding ownership interest attached to the original deed. Several investors leaned forward. Board members exchanged tense glances. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. Daniel raised his camera. The attorney paused briefly before continuing. The filing identifies the protected interest holder as Amara Johnson Sterling. The reaction was immediate. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Conversations erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters began speaking rapidly into their phones. The giant screen enlarged the relevant section of the deed. There it was. Clear. Undeniable. Legally certified. Amara Johnson Sterling. The room exploded with noise. Ethan felt as though time had slowed. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. He read the name once. Then again. Then a third time. It never changed. Across the ballroom, dozens of guests turned toward Amara simultaneously. Some appeared shocked. Others impressed. A few seemed embarrassed that they had underestimated her role for so many years. Yet Amara herself did not react. She had known this truth long before anyone else. Charles Whitaker quietly smiled. There she is, he whispered. The founder everyone forgot. Vanessa stared at Ethan. You told me the company belonged to you. Ethan struggled to answer. I believed it did. Believe? The single word carried more weight than anger. Nearby, Daniel Mercer approached another attorney. Does this mean she still has ownership rights? The attorney answered cautiously. Based on what has been presented, it means her legal position may be far more significant than previously understood. That answer spread through the ballroom almost instantly. Guests repeated fragments of it. Investors shared interpretations. Reporters drafted headlines. But the attorney on stage was not finished. He raised his hand for silence. Gradually, the room settled again. There is an additional provision attached to the certified deed. Immediately, the noise disappeared. Every person focused on the stage once more. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Additional provision. Tonight seemed determined to reveal every forgotten secret at once. The attorney continued. The deed does not merely identify the protected ownership holder. He turned another page. It also specifies the authority associated with that protected interest. Board members visibly stiffened. One investor removed his glasses and stared at the document. Daniel stopped writing for a moment. The atmosphere had become electric. Across the room, Amara finally lifted her eyes toward the screen. Not with excitement, not with triumph, with quiet acceptance, as though she had spent years preparing herself for this exact moment. The attorney reviewed the final paragraph. Several board members immediately requested copies. One of them began reading so quickly that he nearly dropped the papers. Ethan noticed the reaction and felt a wave of dread unlike anything he had experienced during his entire business career. Because these were not the reactions of people discovering something minor. These were the reactions of people discovering something transformative. The attorney slowly looked up from the document. Ladies and gentlemen, he said carefully, the authority attached to this protected interest may affect not only historical ownership recognition, but current corporate control. The words struck the room like thunder. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Amara Johnson Sterling. And for the first time all evening, Ethan Sterling realized that the woman standing quietly near the back of the ballroom might possess far more power over the future of Sterling Dynamics than anyone in the room had ever imagined. The words current corporate control seemed to linger in the air long after the attorney finished speaking. Nobody in the ballroom moved. The engagement party had completely disappeared beneath the weight of the revelation unfolding before them. Ethan Sterling stood beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers, staring at the screen where Amara Johnson Sterling's name remained displayed in large letters. For years he had walked through headquarters bearing the title of founder, chief executive officer, visionary, and architect of Sterling Dynamics. Yet tonight, piece by piece, a different version of the company's history was emerging. One that could no longer be ignored. The attorney reviewed several additional pages while board members gathered near the stage. Quiet conversations broke out among legal advisors. Investors checked messages from colleagues. Reporters continued transmitting updates to newsrooms across the country. Daniel Mercer knew he was witnessing the type of corporate story that rarely happened more than once in a generation. He approached Charles Whitaker. Do you understand what this means? Charles looked toward Amara before answering. I think we are about to find out that the company was built on agreements most people stopped reading years ago. Nearby, Vanessa Blake folded her arms. Her expression had changed from confidence to frustration. This is impossible, she said quietly. How can something this important remain hidden? Ethan finally spoke. Because nobody looked. The answer surprised even him. Yet as soon as he said it, he realized it was true. Success had a way of encouraging people to focus on the future while ignoring the foundation beneath it. The attorney returned to the microphone. Instantly, the room became silent again. The board has requested clarification regarding the governance authority attached to the protected interest. Several cameras lifted simultaneously. The attorney continued. The original deed contains language granting the protected interest holder approval authority over any transaction capable of fundamentally altering the company's ownership structure. A collective gasp moved through the audience. Board members exchanged alarmed looks. Investors leaned forward. Daniel stopped writing for a moment simply to absorb what he had heard. Approval authority. The phrase carried enormous implications. The attorney continued reading. This authority applies to mergers, acquisitions, restructuring events, ownership transfers, and succession actions affecting controlling interests. Vanessa turned toward Ethan. Succession actions? Ethan understood immediately. So did several attorneys standing near the stage. The engagement party had not merely been a personal celebration. Earlier that evening, Ethan had publicly discussed future leadership, plans, and organizational changes connected to his upcoming marriage. Several of those initiatives involved ownership restructuring. Suddenly, those plans looked far less certain. The attorney opened another page. The legal review found no evidence that the protected authority was ever terminated, transferred, or lawfully revoked. The ballroom erupted once more. Some investors appeared nervous. Others seemed fascinated. Reporters rushed to capture reactions from board members. Through it all, Amara remained silent. Her composure had become almost legendary within the room. She neither celebrated nor corrected anyone. She simply allowed the truth to stand on its own. Ethan watched her from across the ballroom. For the first time in years, he found himself remembering not business meetings or legal documents, but conversations, promises, dreams, long nights spent planning a future together. Back then, neither of them cared about control. They cared about survival. They cared about building something meaningful. Somewhere along the way, success had complicated everything. The attorney raised his hand for silence once more. There is one final conclusion from the review. Every conversation stopped immediately. The room became completely still. Even the reporters lowered their phones. The attorney looked directly at the board members before speaking. Based on the certified deed, the original founding agreement, the emergency capital provisions, and the surviving governance clauses, the legal department has determined that Amara Johnson Sterling remains an active, protected founder within the corporate structure of Sterling Dynamics. Shock rippled through the ballroom. Not former founder. Not historical founder. Active, protected founder. The distinction changed everything. Daniel Mercer knew instantly that tomorrow's headlines had just written themselves. Vanessa took a slow step backward. Several investors exchanged stunned glances. Charles Whitaker closed his eyes and smiled faintly. It was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of a man watching history finally correct itself. Across the room, hundreds of eyes turned toward Amara. For the first time all evening, she slowly stepped away from the display case and began walking toward the stage. The crowd instinctively parted to create a path. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Ethan watched her approach beneath the warm ballroom lights. Every step seemed to carry 15 years of forgotten history with it. When she finally reached the front of the room, the attorney carefully stepped aside. The microphone remained waiting at the center of the stage. And for the first time that night, the entire future of Sterling Dynamics appeared ready to hear what Amara Johnson Sterling had to say. The ballroom remained completely silent as Amara Johnson Sterling stepped onto the stage. The bright lights reflected softly across the polished floor while hundreds of guests watched her approach the microphone. Investors, attorneys, executives, journalists, and board members all seemed to share the same question. What would she do now? Ethan Sterling stood only a few feet away. For years he had commanded rooms like this with confidence. Tonight he found himself listening instead. Amara paused briefly at the center of the stage. She looked across the audience, taking in the faces of people who had witnessed the unraveling of a story many believed they already understood. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady. I did not come here tonight to embarrass anyone. The simplicity of the statement immediately changed the atmosphere. Several reporters lowered their cameras. Others listened more carefully. Amara continued. I came because I received an invitation, and because I believed the truth deserved a seat at the same table as the celebration. The room remained silent. Ethan lowered his eyes. Every word seemed directed not only at the audience, but at him as well. Amara glanced toward the giant screen where the recovered documents remained displayed. 15 years ago, there were no reporters, no investors, no ballroom. There was only a dream. The audience listened carefully. A dream built by two people who believed hard work could create something bigger than themselves. For a moment, memories seemed to move through the room. The photographs displayed behind her showed the old garage, the folding tables, the exhausted smiles, and the uncertain beginnings that no amount of corporate success could erase. Amara continued. The company mattered, but the people building it mattered more. Several former employees nodded quietly. Many of them remembered those early years. Some remembered her personally. Others remembered stories that had gradually disappeared from company history. Daniel Mercer wrote every word. He realized this was no longer a corporate scandal. It was something far more powerful. It was a correction. Amara looked toward the audience again. I never asked for recognition. The statement carried genuine sincerity. I never asked for headlines. I never asked anyone to rewrite history for my benefit. Her eyes briefly met Ethan's. But I also never expected history to forget so much. The words landed heavily throughout the ballroom. Ethan felt them more deeply than anyone else. Because he knew there was truth in them. Success had arrived quickly. Then larger offices, bigger investors, national attention, international expansion. Somewhere within all of it, the original story became simplified. Easier to market, easier to tell, easier to believe. Amara continued speaking. The documents presented tonight do not belong to me. They belong to the truth. That sentence created another wave of silence. No anger, no accusation, no revenge, only truth. Charles Whitaker smiled faintly from his seat. He had spent years hoping this day would arrive. Vanessa Blake stood near the front row listening carefully. The confidence she carried at the beginning of the evening had vanished completely. Yet even she appeared affected by the dignity with which Amara carried herself. Then Amara said something nobody expected. I am not interested in taking anything away from Sterling Dynamics. A visible reaction moved through the audience. Investors exchanged surprised glances. Board members looked relieved. Reporters immediately began writing again. Ethan slowly looked up. Amara continued. This company changed my life. It created opportunities for thousands of employees and their families. I would never want to harm that. Several people visibly relaxed. Yet Daniel Mercer noticed something important. Amara had not finished. But there is a difference between ownership and stewardship. The room became quiet again. Ownership is about what belongs to you. Stewardship is about what you protect for others. The words seemed to settle across the ballroom. Ethan stared at her. For the first time in years, he remembered exactly why he had fallen in love with her. Not because of ambition, not because of business success, because of the way she always saw beyond herself. Amara looked toward the board members. The future of this company should be built on honesty, not omissions, not assumptions, not forgotten agreements. Several board members nodded. They understood precisely what she meant. Then one attorney approached the stage and quietly handed the board chair a newly completed legal summary based on the recovered records. The board chair reviewed the document, then looked visibly stunned. Ethan immediately noticed the reaction. So did every reporter in the room. The board chair stood slowly and walked toward the microphone. His expression had changed completely. The audience sensed another revelation approaching, one even larger than the previous ones. He looked first at Amara, then at Ethan. Finally, he faced the crowd. Based on the completed review, he said carefully, there is one final determination the board must announce tonight. The ballroom fell silent once again. And as the board chair unfolded the final page of the legal summary, Ethan Sterling realized that the ultimate consequence of the forgotten deed was only now beginning to emerge. The ballroom seemed to shrink around the board chair as he unfolded the final page of the legal summary. Every sound disappeared. The reporters stopped typing. The investors stopped whispering. Even the staff standing near the walls remained motionless. Hundreds of people waited for the conclusion that would finally connect every document, every forgotten agreement, and every revelation uncovered throughout the evening. The board chair adjusted his glasses and looked down at the report prepared by the legal department. His voice was steady, but the significance of his words was unmistakable. After reviewing the founding deed, the emergency capital provisions, the protected ownership clause, and all surviving governance records, the board recognizes Amara Johnson Sterling as an active protected founder with standing authority under the original corporate structure. The room absorbed the statement in silence. Then he continued. Furthermore, the review confirms that several ownership actions proposed during the current restructuring process required her approval before implementation. A visible reaction swept through the audience. Investors exchanged worried looks. Attorneys immediately began discussing implications. Journalists rushed to update their stories. Ethan Sterling felt the weight of every decision made during the past decade settle upon him at once. The board chair lowered the document briefly before continuing. Because those approvals were never obtained, the board is suspending all pending restructuring actions until a full review is completed. Another wave of murmurs spread through the ballroom. Vanessa Blake stared at the stage in disbelief. The future she had imagined only hours earlier was dissolving in front of her. She looked toward Ethan, expecting reassurance. Instead, she found a man lost in thought. A man confronting truths he could no longer avoid. "Say something," she whispered. Ethan remained silent. For years he had believed success justified moving forward without looking back. Tonight, he was discovering the cost of that belief. Across the stage, Amara listened without celebration. She had not asked for the review. She had not orchestrated the discoveries. She had simply lived long enough to see the truth reach the surface. Daniel Mercer watched carefully. What fascinated him most was not the legal outcome. It was Amara's reaction. Most people given this moment would have seized it. They would have delivered speeches, claimed victory, demanded recognition. Instead, she stood quietly while others spoke. The truth required no performance. The board chair continued reading. The board also acknowledges that historical contributions made by Amara Johnson Sterling were materially significant to the survival and development of Sterling Dynamics. Several guests began applauding. The sound started softly near the back of the room. Then others joined. Former employees, early investors, people who remembered the company's beginnings. The applause gradually spread throughout the ballroom. Ethan looked around the room and realized something painful. The recognition being given to Amara tonight was not manufactured. It was genuine. People were not applauding because they had been told to. They were applauding because they finally understood. Vanessa slowly lowered her eyes. The attention that had once belonged to the engagement celebration now belonged entirely to a woman she had underestimated. After several moments, the applause faded. The board chair stepped away from the microphone. The legal review was complete. The facts had been presented. The room waited for what would happen next. Ethan finally turned toward Amara. For several seconds, neither spoke. The distance between them felt far greater than the few feet separating them on stage. 15 years of memories seemed to stand between them. "I should have remembered," Ethan said quietly. The statement was not intended for the audience, but the silence allowed everyone to hear it. Amara looked at him calmly. It was never about remembering documents. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood. The documents were only evidence. The deeper issue had always been forgetting the people connected to them, forgetting sacrifices, forgetting promises, forgetting the foundation beneath success. For the first time all evening, genuine regret appeared on his face. Not regret over ownership, not regret over corporate control, regret over losing sight of what mattered. Nearby, Vanessa took a slow step backward, then another. She realized she was witnessing a conversation that had begun long before she entered either of their lives. A conversation unfinished for years. Without creating a scene, she quietly left the front row and moved toward the exit. Few people noticed. Most eyes remained fixed on Ethan and Amara. Daniel Mercer lowered his notebook. He sensed that the most important moment of the evening was no longer legal. It was personal. Amara glanced across the ballroom one final time. The documents remained displayed on the giant screen. The truth was now public. Nothing could return to the way it had been. Yet something surprising happened inside the room. The tension that had dominated the evening began to fade. In its place came clarity. The story no longer belonged to rumors, assumptions, or forgotten records. It belonged to facts. The board members gathered quietly near the stage. Investors appeared calmer. Even the reporters sensed that the final chapter was approaching. Then Charles Whitaker stepped forward and handed Amara a small envelope that had remained untouched throughout the night. She looked at it with visible surprise. "What is this?" she asked. Charles smiled gently. "Something that was always meant to be yours." The room grew silent once more. Ethan looked toward the envelope. So did every attorney, reporter, and board member present. Because if the evening had taught them anything, it was that the past still contained secrets. And as Amara slowly opened the envelope beneath the ballroom lights, everyone realized that one final truth remained waiting to be revealed. Amara carefully opened the envelope while the ballroom watched in complete silence. The paper inside appeared old, its edges softened by time. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then a faint smile touched her face. Not a smile of victory, not a smile of revenge, a smile of recognition. Ethan watched from only a few feet away. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Amara looked toward Charles Whitaker before answering. Charles folded his hands and smiled. "Read it." Slowly, Amara unfolded the document. The audience waited. Reporters held their breath. Cameras remained fixed on the stage. Even the board members leaned forward. Amara's eyes moved across the page. Then she laughed softly for the first time all evening. The sound surprised everyone. After hours of legal revelations and forgotten history, nobody expected laughter. "It is the original letter," she said. Ethan frowned. "What letter?" Amara looked at him. "The one we wrote during our first year." Recognition immediately appeared on Ethan's face. His eyes widened slightly. He remembered. 15 years earlier, before investors, before acquisitions, before wealth and recognition, they had written a letter together. Not for lawyers, not for shareholders, for themselves. A promise sealed in an envelope and stored among the company's founding records. Charles nodded. "I found it while reviewing the archives." Amara looked down and began reading aloud. "If Sterling Dynamics ever becomes successful, we promise never to measure that success by money alone. We promise to remember every person who helped build it. We promise that no achievement will ever matter more than character. And if we ever lose sight of these values, may this letter remind us where we started." The ballroom remained silent. No one expected the final secret to be so simple. Yet somehow it felt more powerful than every ownership clause presented that night. Ethan lowered his head. Each sentence struck harder than any legal ruling. Because unlike contracts, this document revealed who they once were. The giant screen displayed the handwritten letter. Guests studied the faded signatures at the bottom. Ethan Sterling, Amara Johnson, two young dreamers who believed success would never change them. Daniel Mercer slowly lowered his notebook. The story he planned to publish suddenly seemed different. This was no longer a story about ownership. It was a story about memory, about promises, about the cost of forgetting. Amara folded the letter carefully and looked toward the audience. This is what mattered most. Her voice remained calm. Not the deed, not the ownership percentages, not the authority clauses. She glanced toward the screen. Those documents protected the company. This letter protected the reason we built it. Several guests nodded quietly. Even some investors appeared moved. The board chair approached the microphone one final time. "After consultation with counsel, the board will formally recognize Amara Johnson Sterling as co-founder and protected founder of Sterling Dynamics. Historical records will be updated accordingly." Applause immediately filled the ballroom. This time it lasted much longer. Former employees stood first, then investors, then board members. Eventually, nearly everyone in the room was standing. Ethan joined them. He looked toward Amara and applauded along with everyone else. Not because the board required it, because it was deserved. When the applause finally faded, Ethan stepped forward. "There is something I need to say." The room grew quiet again. He faced Amara directly. "I cannot change the years that passed. I cannot change the mistakes I made. But I can acknowledge the truth." His voice carried clearly throughout the ballroom. "Sterling Dynamics would not exist without you." Amara remained silent. Ethan continued. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot that." The honesty in his words surprised many people. There was no attempt to defend himself. No attempt to redirect responsibility. Only truth. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Amara nodded. A small gesture. Yet it seemed to release years of tension. Not complete healing. Not complete reconciliation. But understanding. Sometimes that was where healing began. Outside the ballroom windows, the lights of Chicago stretched across the night sky. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from the beginning of the evening. The celebration that people expected had never happened. Something better had. The truth had returned. The board members began discussing future plans. Investors resumed conversations. Reporters prepared their stories. Yet the most important chapter had already been written. Not in a legal document. Not in a corporate filing. In the simple recognition that history belonged to everyone who helped create it. As guests slowly departed, the giant screen displayed one final photograph from the company's earliest days. Ethan and Amara standing together beside a folding table inside a tiny garage, smiling at a future they could not yet see. The image remained illuminated above the ballroom long after the crowd began leaving. A reminder that success may change circumstances, but the truth always remembers where the journey began. And for the first time in 15 years, Sterling Dynamics finally did too.